The ocean looked calm, too calm for what was about to happen. Then came the question that would shake Washington, Caracas, and every navy operating in contested waters. How could a routine US Coast Guard patrol turn into an international incident that left 2 Venezuelan warships on the seafloor in under 18 minutes? What began as a standard counter-narcotics mission north of La Guaira suddenly shifted into a deliberate act of escalation, a moment where miscalculation met political desperation and the stakes exploded far beyond the horizon. According to operational records, USCGC Stone had spent the previous 72 hours stripping millions of dollars in cocaine shipments from drug-running boats linked to regime-connected networks in Venezuela. Each seizure cut directly into the financial arteries of groups aligned with the Maduro government. It was enough to provoke anger, yet no one expected naval retaliation. But at 13:47 local time, Venezuelan command made a fateful decision. 3 Constitution-class patrol vessels were ordered to intercept Stone not for diplomacy, but for coercion and spectacle. These were not lightly armed ships. They displaced nearly 1,800 tons each, carrying 76mm automatic cannons, 40mm guns, missiles, and crews trained for coastal defense. In total, 183 Venezuelan sailors surged toward a single US cutter that carried nothing remotely comparable, just a 57mm deck gun and several 50 caliber mounts intended for interdiction, not war. Caracas believed it could force Stone out of the region, film a humiliating retreat, and claim victory on national television. By 14:03, Stone's radar detected 3 fast-moving contacts closing at 28 knots. The cutter was operating 23 miles outside Venezuelan territorial waters, squarely in international space. Yet the tactical geometry tightened with every minute. Venezuelan commanders were not probing, they were bracketing Stone into a kill box. As the triangle formation tightened, the Americans transmitted emergency alerts to US 4th Fleet in Mayport and requested immediate support. The nearest asset was the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer USS Gravely, still more than an hour away at combat speed. But Venezuelan officers believed the window was theirs. At 14:14, the lead ship Guamacuto issued an ultimatum: withdraw or face consequences. Stone responded calmly, asserting international navigation rights. 3 minutes later, the first 76mm warning round splashed just ahead of the cutter's bow, transforming the encounter from intimidation into an armed conflict. Battle stations sounded instantly aboard Stone. Fire teams sealed compartments, machine gunners took their positions, and the 57mm crew stood ready. The Venezuelan ships closed from multiple angles. Guamacuto pressed from the front, Yaguaraparo slid starboard to Manacaco moved port side. For the Americans, the realization hit they were outgunned, out-armored, and surrounded. The moment symbolized something larger: how fast gray zone operations can collapse into open confrontation. The balance between law enforcement presence and military deterrence, a balance long maintained in the Caribbean, snapped in seconds. If a single tactical error occurred, the United States risked a hostage crisis, a propaganda disaster, or a wider regional escalation, and yet the Venezuelan command believed it held the advantage. But the next moments would prove how catastrophically misjudged that belief truly was. The attack came faster than most naval crews ever experience. At 14:21, as Stone maneuvered to maintain distance, Guamacuto fired the first true combat round, a 76mm shell that slammed into the cutter's stern, shattering communication gear and injuring 3 sailors with debris and burns. It was the moment the engagement crossed a point of no return. No warning shots, no ambiguity. Venezuela had opened fire on a US military vessel operating in international waters, a decision as reckless as it was irreversible. Damage control teams surged into action, sealing compartments, treating wounded crew, and fighting flames rising from ruptured equipment. But the situation deteriorated swiftly. The second Venezuelan ship, Yaguaraparo, closed to Stone's starboard side guns ready. The third Tamanacaco maneuvered to port, completing the encirclement. 3 hulls totaling more than 5,400 tons of displacement surrounded a single lightly armed cutter designed primarily for interdiction, not naval warfare. Venezuelan intent was unmistakable: disable the ship force, a surrender, detain US personnel, and broadcast the images as national triumph. For the Maduro government, battered by economic collapse and international isolation, capturing American sailors would have been a symbolic victory, one that could be exploited domestically and used as leverage abroad. But such a plan ignored a hard truth of modern conflict: once a shot is fired at the United States, the response comes with overwhelming force. Stone attempted to stabilize course, but the rain of incoming fire intensified. At 1426, Yaguaraparo unleashed additional 76 cm rounds toward midships. A lifeboat disintegrated in the blast. Windows and fittings shattered. The galley erupted in flames. 7 more crew members were injured. In minutes, the cutter experienced more battle damage than most Coast Guard crews ever face in an entire career. Inside the control room, alarms overlapped, flooding alerts, fire warnings, propulsion, strain, radio degradation. Yet the crew held formation, executing procedures drilled countless times, but rarely tested under true naval fire. The cutter listed slightly to port. Hull plates groaned under impact. Still propulsion held, and more importantly, so did discipline. At 1424, the 50-cm aboard Stone fired its first return salvo. The gun tore into Guamacudo's superstructure, damaging radars and igniting localized fires. But the Venezuelan hulls were too heavy and too well armored for a 57mm alone to shift the battle's momentum. The Coast Guard could slow them, wound them, but not stop them. The attackers continued to close. Behind them, however, something far more dangerous was racing toward the battlefield. The USS Gravely, having received the distress call at 1404, had already pushed to flank speed cutting through the Atlantic at over 32 knots. Onboard combat systems came alive, a destroyer built for missile duels and high-intensity warfare preparing to defend a cutter under siege. Still, Stone had to survive long enough for Gravely to enter weapons range. Every minute mattered, every shell risked more casualties, and every attempt by Venezuelan commanders to close the gap brought them one step closer to a disaster of their own making. Because the moment Gravely reached Harpoon range, the entire geometry of the battle and the fate of Venezuela's warships would change forever. The ocean between the embattled cutter and its oncoming protector narrowed with every second. By 1421, the USS Gravely had already committed to maximum throttle 32 knots engines, screaming as the destroyer tore through the Atlantic. Inside its Combat Information Center, officers tracked a battlefield that was deteriorating by the minute Stone wounded surrounded taking fire, yet still maneuvering and still fighting back. The question hanging over the CIC was grim: would the cutter survive long enough for the destroyer to reach standoff missile range? Communication between Stone and Gravely was intermittent. Damage to the cutter's communication tower forced reliance on backup channels, but the message had been clear: this was no harassment. This was an attack. As Gravely raced forward, radar operators updated range estimates 112 miles at first detection, then 90, then 78. The destroyer needed to be inside roughly 70 miles to employ the Harpoon anti-ship missile system. At Gravely's speed, that meant minutes if Stone could hold out. In Washington, the situation report reached the National Military Command Center. President Donald Trump was briefed immediately. Officials evaluated not only the tactical threat, but the geopolitical implications: a U.S. cutter under fire, a hostile state attacking American service members, and the possibility of escalation if Venezuelan forces attempted to board the vessel. Any images of captured U.S. sailors would inflame domestic and international politics, and Venezuelan leadership almost certainly understood the propaganda value. Yet the attack proceeded anyway. At 1423, Gravely's commanding officer received authorization for weapons release if Stone's survival required it. This was a turning point. Destroyers do not fire harpoons lightly. Each missile can alter the political landscape as much as the tactical one. But authorization now matched reality. Venezuelan forces had fired first inflicted casualties and continued to press the assault. While Gravely accelerated, Stone's condition worsened. Fires continued in the galley. Multiple compartments required shoring to prevent flooding. Medics worked with limited space and equipment to stabilize the 7 wounded. The cutter still had propulsion, but evasive maneuvers were hampered by mounting structural damage. Worse, Venezuelan ships were attempting to close distance for a potential boarding. A boarding attempt would have transformed the episode entirely, no longer a naval skirmish, but a hostage crisis with global consequences. And Venezuelan commanders appeared convinced they had the advantage. But they underestimated how quickly the destroyer was closing. At 1431, radar confirmed it. Gravely was now approximately 66 miles from the engagement area, just inside the Harpoon employment envelope. In the CIC fire control specialists designated target priority Guamacudo first, Yaguaraparo second, Tamanacaco third. The logic was simple: neutralize the most aggressive attacker and collapse the formation's cohesion. Seconds mattered. Stone continued firing, but rounds that struck Guamacudo only bought time. Gravely was rapidly transforming into lethal advantage. The Venezuelan commanders still believed they controlled the battlefield. They believed pressure would break the Americans' resolve. They believed the cutter could be overwhelmed before support arrived. They were wrong on every count. At 1432, the destroyer reached the decisive threshold. And with a single order, calm, measured, inevitable, the USS gravely prepared to rewrite the battle, the region, and the Venezuelan Navy's fate in under 10 minutes. The order came at 1432. Calm, precise, final. Moments later, 4 Harpoon missiles erupted from the USS Gravely's launchers, each one a 488-pound message that the battle was no longer a lopsided confrontation, but a reversal so overwhelming that the Venezuelan formation would not survive it. The missiles ignited, arced skyward, shed their boosters, and dropped to sea-skimming altitude, racing toward the 3 patrol ships locked onto stone like predators closing in on wounded prey. The Venezuelan captains saw nothing at first. Their radars were degraded from Stone's return fire. Their ships lacked modern missile defense systems, and harpoons fly too low for most medium-sized warships to detect until seconds before impact. What the patrol boats did sense was Stone's change in posture, the cutter still damaged, and listing suddenly began maneuvering away at an angle suggesting it knew something they didn't. At approximately 1438, alarms finally sounded aboard Guamacuto. Radar operators caught the signature small, fast sea-skimming objects closing at terrifying speed. There was no time for countermeasures, no CIWS, no decoys, no missile defeat systems. The crew had maybe 7 seconds. It wasn't enough. At 1439, the first harpoon slammed into Guamacuto at the waterline near the engineering spaces. The explosion ripped through bulkheads, rupturing fuel lines and starting massive fires. A second harpoon struck seconds later, obliterating the bridge, killing the command staff instantly and structurally snapping the vessel. Guamacuto began sinking in under 90 seconds, an entire warship erased before Venezuelan commanders could fully process what had happened. Yaguaraparo, attempting desperate evasive maneuvers, fared no better. A harpoon locked onto its hull broadside. The explosion lifted the vessel, fractured the keel, and rolled it violently. Flooding was immediate and catastrophic. Within 4 minutes, the patrol ship capsized and disappeared beneath the Atlantic. What had begun as a coordinated Venezuelan assault was now a ruin of flame debris and collapsing metal. The lone surviving ship Tamanakako watched the destruction unfold in real time. The captain understood instantly there would be no boarding operation, no televised humiliation of captured Americans, no triumphant narrative for Caracas. Their naval action, intended as a show of sovereignty and defiance, had instead resulted in the loss of 2 warships and dozens of sailors in less than 5 minutes. At 1439, with panic rising among the crew and fires visible across the ocean, Tamanakako cut engines and hoisted a white flag. Surrender, unconditional and immediate, was the only path to survival. 2 additional harpoons, already airborne, were redirected by Gravelli's fire control team to impact harmlessly in open waters. The destroyer, having delivered decisive force, now delivered restraint. The battle was effectively over. Stone, though battered and still burning in several compartments, used the brief window to pull away from the engagement area. The cutter's crew had endured direct hits, casualties, and near encirclement, yet their discipline and defensive action kept the ship afloat long enough for Gravely to intervene. Within minutes, the destroyer launched small boats to recover survivors from the sinking Venezuelan ships. Some sailors clung to debris, others were burned injured or in shock. US crews moved with urgency, not as avengers, but as rescuers fulfilling obligations under maritime law, even as the political consequences began to erupt. 2 Venezuelan warships lay on the seafloor. A third sat dead in the water under American control. An attempted seizure of a US cutter had ended in one of the most lopsided naval defeats in modern Western Hemisphere history. And the geopolitical shockwaves were only beginning. News of the sinking spread faster than the smoke drifting over the Atlantic. Within hours, governments from Bogota to Brussels requested emergency briefings. Analysts in Washington, London, and Berlin scrambled to assess what the confrontation meant, not only for US-Venezuela relations, but for a global security environment already strained by wars in Ukraine, escalating Israel-Iran proxy clashes, and a sharpening US-China standoff. What happened off La Guaira was not an isolated event. It was another warning flare in a world where small miscalculations can trigger international crises with breathtaking speed. In Caracas, Venezuelan state media attempted immediate damage control. They claimed Stone had violated sovereign waters that the United States had attacked without provocation, and that the loss of 2 patrol vessels was the result of foreign aggression. But satellite imagery, maritime AIS data, and intercept logs published by international monitoring groups contradicted the narrative. Reuters and DW reported that Stone was clearly operating in international waters 23 miles outside Venezuela's territorial sea when the first shots were fired. The aggression was not American, it was Venezuelan, deliberate and disastrously misjudged. Washington's response was swift but measured. President Trump, informed of the final casualty numbers and the surrender of Tamanacaco, addressed the crisis as both a national security matter and a strategic signal. The message was unmistakable: the United States would defend its personnel, its vessels, and its maritime rights overwhelmingly if necessary. NATO leaders, following British and Dutch intelligence assessments, called the incident a stark reminder that regional instability in the Americas can escalate with the same unpredictability now seen in the Black Sea or the Red Sea. For military analysts, the parallels were undeniable. In Ukraine, smaller Russian vessels operating without layered air defense had been repeatedly destroyed by long-range precision weapons, much as Venezuela's patrol boats were wiped out by Harpoons. In the eastern Mediterranean, Israeli vessels face persistent missile threats from Iranian-backed groups that mirror the vulnerability of mid-range navies lacking robust defensive suites. And in the Pacific, US and Chinese ships operate in tense proximity, where a single misinterpreted maneuver could ignite a confrontation with consequences far beyond regional borders. The Caribbean episode underscored the same strategic truth: technology, not numbers, dictates dominance. 3 ships surrounding a single cutter seemed overwhelming until a destroyer 66 miles away entered the fight. Firepower sensors and command systems overturned the Venezuelan advantage in under 5 minutes. Regional governments reacted quickly. Colombia condemned Venezuela's reckless escalation. Brazil called for de-escalation, but privately acknowledged that the incident exposed Venezuela's inability to counter modern missiles. Mexico issued a neutral statement, but urged respect for international waters, a subtle reprimand aimed at Caracas. China and Russia, both partners of Venezuela, expressed concern, but avoided deeper commitments, unwilling to be pulled into a crisis that weakened their ally. Inside Venezuela's military leadership, panic turned to blame. Courts-martial began within weeks, targeting officers who ordered the assault, but disciplining individuals could not erase the broader humiliation. 2 warships lost, dozens dead, a 3rd captured intact, a failed operation that inadvertently reinforced US maritime supremacy rather than undermining it. Behind closed doors, Pentagon planners initiated sweeping changes. Coast Guard cutters operating near Venezuelan or similarly unstable waters would now deploy only with naval escorts shifting from law enforcement posture to combat-ready formations. The Caribbean, long a zone of counter-narcotics operations, now stood as another flashpoint requiring deterrence, resilience, and rapid response. Yet the deeper question lingered: what drove Venezuela to gamble so recklessly? Economic collapse, political desperation, a misreading of American resolve, or a belief that the US was too distracted by global crises to respond decisively? Whatever the reason, the consequences had destabilized an entire region. When the smoke cleared and the ships stopped burning, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Behind every geopolitical gamble, every aggressive maneuver, every exchange of fire, there are human beings, crews who follow orders, families who wait for answers, and nations forced to confront the cost of decisions made far above the waterline. The battle off La Guaira was no exception. As Stone steadied course and Gravely's rescue teams pulled Venezuelan sailors from the waves, the scale of the human toll emerged. 33 Venezuelan crew members were dead. 89 survivors drifted in shock. On the American side, 7 Coast Guard sailors were wounded, none killed, but all scarred by the suddenness of a fight they never sought. For the families in Caracas, the news came slowly shrouded in state propaganda and political spin. Officials tried to frame the battle as a victory, an improbable claim when 2 ships lay on the seabed. But as international reporting from Reuters, BBC, and Al Jazeera cut through the narrative, the public anger grew. Why were Venezuelan sailors ordered into a confrontation they could not possibly win? Why had leadership gambled with human lives to stage a political spectacle? Quietly, officers within the Venezuelan command structure questioned the same decisions. Courts-martial followed. Careers ended, but accountability came too late for the dead. Meanwhile, analysts across NATO drew another conclusion: the Caribbean had become a strategic microcosm of a much larger global pattern. In Ukraine, Russia's naval losses demonstrated the vulnerability of medium-sized fleets lacking modern missile defenses. In the Middle East, Israel and Iran continued testing each other with drones and missile strikes that risked spiraling out of control. In the Pacific, US and Chinese ships operated in tense proximity where a single misread maneuver could trigger global shockwaves. The Venezuelan incident echoed all of it, a reminder that in 2025, conflicts no longer simmer. They jump from routine patrols to lethal exchanges in seconds. For the United States, the engagement forced a doctrinal shift. Coast Guard cutters, symbols of maritime law enforcement, could no longer operate alone near hostile or politically volatile waters. Escorts, early warning systems, and rapid response destroyer deployments became mandatory. The line between policing and warfare blurred further, raising a difficult question: how should a democratic society balance the need for security with the risk that every patrol might become a battlefield? Yet, amid the policy debates, the human stories endured. Stone's crew, battered but alive, carried the weight of split-second decisions that saved their ship. Gravely's sailors, trained for high-intensity warfare, found themselves both warriors and rescuers in the same hour, launching missiles one moment, pulling injured Venezuelan sailors from the water the next. And the Venezuelan survivors, many young and barely trained for missile warfare, would return home facing both grief and a government desperate to shift blame. What remained was a final sobering realization: the sea, once a buffer between nations, has become a stage where power, desperation, and miscalculation collide with devastating speed. Two ships now rest on the ocean floor, a permanent memorial to a decision that spiraled beyond control. And the world is left with a haunting question: if such a small clash can ignite region-wide tension, what happens when the next miscalculation occurs between far stronger powers across the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, or the South China Sea? A routine US Coast Guard patrol detonated into one of the most lopsided naval clashes in modern Western Hemisphere history. After seizing millions in cartel-linked cocaine, USCGC Stone was ambushed in international waters by 3 Venezuelan patrol ships acting under direct orders to coerce, intimidate, and potentially capture American personnel. The cutter held its ground but was quickly overwhelmed, taking multiple hits and casualties as Venezuelan commanders attempted to close for a boarding operation. Racing at flank speed, the USS gravely entered missile range and fired 4 Harpoon missiles, sinking 2 Venezuelan warships in under 5 minutes and forcing the third to surrender. The aftermath sent shockwaves through Latin America, NATO, and global security circles, echoing wider geopolitical tensions from Ukraine to the South China Sea. The United States revised its maritime doctrine, transitioning from law enforcement patrols to escorted combat-ready deployments. But beneath the strategy lay the human cost: dead and injured sailors' families searching for answers, and a region reminded how quickly miscalculation can trigger catastrophe. The battle left a deeper question unresolved in a world of rising tensions. How many more confrontations are one decision away from spiraling into something far worse?